The year is 1833. While parliaments debated in London, a quiet revolution was unfolding on the other side of the world. It wasn't a revolution of swords and cannons, but of parchment and law. And it marked the moment Britain didn't just take India's wealth, it systematically dismantled its soul. We often talk about the British Raj, about stolen gold and plundered resources. And yes, that happened. But the real theft, the deeper wound inflicted in 1833, was the theft of India's sovereignty. Britain didn't just want India's spices and diamonds. They wanted to colonize its very right to self-govern. Let's be clear. Before 1833, the British presence in India was complex. The East India Company was a powerful trading entity, yes, but it operated, at least in theory, within a framework that allowed for a degree of Indian autonomy, particularly at the local and princely state level. There were treaties, there were agreements, often unequal and exploitative, but there was a recognition, however grudging, of existing Indian polities. But the Charter Act of 1833, passed by the British Parliament, fundamentally changed everything. This was not a negotiation, it was a decree, a piece of legislation authored in Westminster that unilaterally declared Britain's supreme authority over the vast subcontinent. Think about it. A distant parliament, thousands of miles away with no Indian representation, decided to redraw the map of governance for millions of people. They didn't ask, they didn't consult, they legislated. What exactly did this act do? It was insidious in its ambition. Firstly, it stripped the East India Company of its commercial functions entirely. It was no longer a trading company. It was now a political and administrative arm of the British Crown. This wasn't about British merchants becoming more efficient. It was about consolidating power. The company's entire purpose shifted from profit-making to political domination. Then came the crucial part. The act centralized power in the hands of the Governor-General of Bengal, transforming him into the Governor-General of India. This created a uniformed, overarching British administrative structure. Before 1833, presidencies like Bengal, Bombay, and Madras had their own governors and councils, often with distinct policies and degrees of autonomy. The 1833 Act dismantled these regional powers, subordinating them to a single, central authority in Calcutta. This meant that laws were no longer being made by local rulers or even by regional British administrators in consultation with them. New laws, imposed from London through the Governor-General, now applied across the entire continent. This was the death knell for indigenous legislative processes. India's own institutions, imperfect as they may have been, were systematically sidelined. The Act also introduced the concept of English as the language of administration and courts. While proponents framed this as a move towards uniformity and modernity, it had a devastating effect. It effectively excluded the vast majority of Indians from meaningful participation in their own governance. Their languages, their customs, their very ways of communicating and asserting rights were rendered obsolete in the new colonial bureaucracy. And let's talk about the legal framework. The Act empowered the Governor-General in Council to legislate for all persons, places, and things within the British territories in India. This was an unprecedented grant of legislative power. It meant that British law, British interpretations, and British interests were now paramount. Indian customs and traditions that conflicted with British interests could be, and were, overridden. Consider the implications of this. Imagine a country where the laws governing your life, your property, your very existence are dictated by individuals who do not share your culture, your history, or your aspirations, and who have no accountability to you. That, in essence, is what the 1833 Act enshrined. This wasn't a gradual assimilation. It was a forceful imposition. It was the creation of a master-servant relationship, codified in law. The British weren't merely collecting taxes. They were establishing a legal basis for their absolute rule. They were declaring that India was not a collection of sovereign entities to be dealt with, but a territory to be governed, like any other British possession. The argument that the British brought order and modernity is a convenient narrative that conveniently ignores the violent suppression of Indian agency. The order they brought was the order of subjugation. The modernity they introduced was a modernity that served their imperial ambitions, not the betterment of the Indian populace. The Act of 1833 was a turning point. It transformed the East India Company from a commercial enterprise with political clout into a direct instrument of crown rule. It laid the foundation for direct British administration and cemented the idea of India as a colony to be managed for the benefit of the colonizer. Think about the psychological impact. For centuries, Indians had governed themselves, established kingdoms, developed sophisticated legal systems, and fostered vibrant cultural traditions. The 1833 Act, in one sweeping legislative act, declared all of that irrelevant. It proclaimed that a foreign power held the ultimate authority, and that Indian governance was now a privilege granted and subject to revocation by the British Crown. This wasn't just about economic exploitation. The gold, the diamonds, the spices, these were symptoms of a deeper disease. The disease was the erosion of Indian self-determination. The 1833 Act was the primary vector for that disease. Historians often debate the precise moment when India lost its sovereignty. But the Charter Act of 1833 stands out as a monumental, if often overlooked, turning point. It was a legal coup d'etat, conducted from afar, that fundamentally altered the relationship between Britain and India. It's easy to get lost in the narratives of battles and rebellions, but the battles for sovereignty are often fought in legislative chambers through the drafting of laws. The 1833 Act was a battle won by Britain, not with muskets, but with the stroke of a pen. This legislation wasn't about protecting India. It wasn't about civilizing India. It was about consolidating British power and ensuring that India, and all its resources, would henceforth exist under British dominion. It was the legal scaffolding upon which the entire edifice of the British Raj was built, cementing a relationship of undeniable inequality and unquestionable British authority. The legacy of this act is profound. It created a power vacuum that was filled by colonial administration, leading to centuries of policies that prioritized British interests over Indian development. It fractured existing social and political structures, often deliberately, to facilitate control. It set a precedent for future colonial legislation, each step further entrenching British dominance. So when we look back at 1833, let us remember it not as a year of minor administrative adjustments, but as the year Britain legally and definitively stole India's sovereignty. They stole the right for Indians to govern themselves, to make their own laws, to chart their own destiny. The gold was a visible plunder, but the theft of sovereignty was an invisible, and perhaps far more devastating, act of conquest. It was the moment India transitioned from being a land of diverse kingdoms and peoples to a colony, defined not by its own will, but by the will of a distant empire. This act didn't just bind India to Britain. It fundamentally redefined what it meant to be Indian in the eyes of the world, and in the eyes of the colonizer. The true cost of 1833 was not measured in pounds sterling, but in the stolen aspirations of a nation.